The unforgiving Dakota sun beat down on the endless sea of grass, a land where peace was as fragile as a dried leaf. In this world, a blind settler girl named Lydia May clutched a simple wooden flute, her only inheritance from a mother she barely remembered. When she stumbled upon a dying Lakota warrior, a man her people considered a mortal enemy, she didn't see a threat. She sensed only pain. And so she played. She played a haunting melody, taught to her in whispers and memories. What happened next is not a legend. It's a testament to the strange and powerful currents that flow beneath the surface of history. Because the following day, at the very hour of his passing, the entire war-bound tribe of that fallen warrior appeared at her family's doorstep, not with weapons raised, but to kneel as one in the dust. This is the story of why. The world for Lydia May was not a thing of sight, but of textures, sounds, and scents. At 17, she had never seen the violent vermilion of a prairie sunset, nor the sharp, intimidating blue of her father's eyes. Her world had been plunged into a soft, impenetrable darkness since birth. But in its place, her other senses had sharpened to a razor's edge. She could feel the subtle shift in the wind that foretold a storm hours before any sighted person saw a cloud. She could smell the difference between the dry dust of the trail and the rich, dark soil of their small corn patch. Most of all, Lydia's world was one of sound. The rustle of cottonwood leaves was a gentle chorus, the chirr of a cicada, a frantic sermon, and the lowing of their single dairy cow, Bess, a comforting baritone. Her father Josiah, a man weathered by grief and toil, moved with a heavy, predictable rhythm. His footsteps on the cabin's porch boards were a slow, deliberate beat, a sound of safety, of presence. They lived on the very edge of what was considered settled land, a lone cabin and a struggling farm carved out of the vast rolling plains of the Dakota Territory in the year 1876. Their nearest neighbor was a hard day's ride east. To the west, the land did not belong to them. It was the ancestral home of the Lakota, a people Josiah spoke of with a cautious respect that bordered on fear. They are the land, Lydia he'd once told her, his voice low. We are just visitors, scratching at its skin. This precarious existence was a source of constant friction. Other settlers clustered in the makeshift township of Providence spoke of the Lakota with a different tone. Men like Caleb Blackwood, a rancher with a hard face and even harder opinions, saw them only as obstacles. Savages, he'd spit the word like a stone. Impediments to progress. God gave us this land to tame, not to share. Lydia felt the tension like a low hum beneath the earth. When riders from Providence came to visit, their voices were tight, their laughter forced. They spoke of skirmishes of stolen livestock, of warriors seen like ghosts on the horizon. They looked at Josiah's isolated homestead as either an act of supreme foolishness or a tacit betrayal. Lydia's only solace, her only true escape, was her mother's flute. Annalise, her mother, had passed from fever when Lydia was just 5, leaving behind only a faded photograph Lydia couldn't see, and the simple 6-holed flute carved from river cane. Josiah rarely spoke of his late wife, the pain still too raw, but he had told Lydia how Annalise would play. It was a strange tune, girl, he'd murmured one evening, the scent of wood smoke and coffee filling the small cabin. Not like a hymn or a jig. It was wild, like the wind whistling through a canyon. She said a friend taught it to her a long time ago. That melody was Lydia's most cherished possession. She couldn't read music, but the notes were etched into her soul. She would retreat to a small, secluded copse of creekside willows, a place only she knew well enough to navigate by touch and sound. There, with the cool water gurgling over stones and the leaves whispering above, she would play. The song was complex and mournful, yet threaded with a resilient strand of hope. It began with a low, breathy note that felt like the earth sighing, then climbed into a series of trills that mimicked a soaring bird. It dipped and swirled, telling a story without words, a tale of loss and endurance, of a bridge between two worlds. When Lydia played it, the gnawing anxiety of their life on the prairie would recede. The harsh words of Caleb Blackwood would fade, and the silent, watchful presence to the west felt less like a threat and more like a shared loneliness. One late afternoon, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in colors, she could only imagine Lydia was in her willow copse. Her fingers danced over the holes of the flute, her breath pouring her own quiet melancholy into the ancient melody. She was so lost in the music that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until they were almost upon her. The gurgle of the creek was suddenly broken by the crack of a twig. Lydia's hands froze the last note, hanging in the air like a ghost. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't her father's heavy tread. This was lighter, more deliberate, almost silent. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice a fragile tremor. Silence answered, but she could feel a presence. She could sense the stillness of another person, the quiet intake of breath. She smelled buckskin horse and the wild, clean scent of the open prairie. It was the smell of the people from the west. A voice, low and resonant, finally spoke. It was not threatening, but filled with a deep, solemn curiosity. The words were not English. They were the fluid, guttural sounds of the Lakota language. Lydia didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was a question. She clutched the flute to her chest, her knuckles white. This was what her father feared. This was the source of the tension that coiled around their lives. Yet here in her sanctuary, the fear was mixed with something else, a profound, overwhelming curiosity. The man did not move closer. He simply stood a silent observer, drawn in by her song. After a long moment, Lydia felt the presence recede. She heard the soft thud of moccasins on earth, fading back the way they came. She remained frozen for a long time, the only sound the frantic beating of her own heart. The man had not been aggressive. He had been listening. She didn't tell her father. The knowledge of it felt too precious, too strange to be tainted by his fear. She had played her mother's song, and a warrior of the Lakota had stopped to listen. It was a secret, a fragile connection made of music in the vast, echoing silence of the prairie. The fragile peace, if it could even be called that, shattered 2 weeks later. The air, already thick with the coming heat of summer, grew heavy with rumor and animosity. A calf from Caleb Blackwood's herd had been found slaughtered near the western range, its carcass left for the vultures. Blackwood needed no more proof. He rode into Providence, his face a mask of fury, his voice a thunderclap in the general store. "This is the last straw," he roared, slamming his fist on the counter, making the glass jars of candy jump. "They're testing us, probing, seeing how much we'll take before we break. I say we stop waiting for them to burn us in our beds. We ride out and we show them this land belongs to the righteous, not the savage." His words were poison, but a poison many were eager to drink. Fear was a powerful motivator, and Blackwood was an expert at dispensing it. He and a dozen other men, including his hot-headed son Finn, formed a militia, as they called it. To Josiah, they were little more than a lynch mob looking for an excuse. Josiah argued against it, his voice a lone beacon of caution in a sea of rage. "Caleb, you don't know who did that. It could have been wolves, could have been anything. You ride into their territory looking for a fight, and a fight is what you will find. You'll bring ruin down on all of us. Stay on your patch of dirt and pray." Then Josiah Blackwood sneered, his eyes full of contempt. "Some of us believe in carving out a future, not hiding from it. When the war drums start, don't come crying to us." The militia rode out the next morning, a grim procession of armed men against the rising sun. Josiah watched them go from his porch, his face etched with dread. "Fools!" He muttered, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle he kept by the door. "They're lighting a fuse without knowing how long it is." Lydia could feel the change in the world. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a nervous energy. Her father was quiet, his movements tense and jerky. He kept her close to the cabin, his usual warnings replaced by stern commands. The world outside her small sphere of sound and touch felt like a coiled serpent. The militia was gone for 2 days. On the 3rd day, the serpent struck. It began with a distant sound, barely audible at first, like the pop of a firecracker. Then another and another. Gunfire. It was coming from the west near the creeklands. Josiah's head snapped up, his body instantly rigid. "Lydia inside. Now! Bar the door and stay away from the window." "What is it, Papa?" she cried, her hands finding the rough wood of the cabin wall. Trouble was all he said, his voice grim. He grabbed his rifle and was gone, his heavy boots pounding the dirt. Lydia was left in the stifling confines of the cabin, her world reduced to a prison of sound. The distant sporadic crack of rifles was terrifying. She could hear shouts, faint and carried on the wind, a mix of enraged English and the powerful war cries of the Lakota. Her imagination, untempered by sight, painted horrific scenes in the darkness of her mind. The battle, a chaotic and brutal skirmish, raged for less than an hour before the sounds began to recede, moving further west as the Lakota warriors drove the settlers back. It was a rout. Blackwood's arrogant charge had been met with a swift and disciplined defense. An agonizing silence fell. Lydia waited, her entire being focused on the sound of her father's returning footsteps. Every gust of wind, every creak of the cabin's wood sent a jolt of terror through her. Finally she heard it, the familiar heavy tread. But it was slower, weighted with exhaustion and something else. Grief. The bar on the door was lifted, and Josiah stumbled in. He smelled of sweat, gunpowder, and a coppery metallic scent that made her stomach clench. Blood. "Papa, are you hurt?" "Not me girl," he rasped, sinking into a chair. "It was a massacre. Blackwood's folly. Finn. Caleb's boy. He's gone. So are 3 others. They were ambushed. The Lakota were waiting for them. It was a trap." He paused, his breath ragged. They fought back hard. There were losses on their side, too. Lydia felt a wave of nausea. The abstract tension had become real, paid for in blood. The men who had laughed and talked in their cabin were dead, and somewhere out on the plains, Lakota families were feeling that same terrible emptiness. That evening, a profound and heavy quiet descended. The sun set, and the world grew cool. Unable to bear the oppressive silence of the cabin, Lydia felt a desperate pull toward her sanctuary, the willow copse. Her father was lost in his own dark thoughts, staring into the fire, so she slipped out unnoticed. She needed the sound of the water, the feel of the familiar path under her feet. She needed her flute. As she drew near the creek, a new sound reached her, cutting through the gurgle of the water. It was a low, guttural noise, a moan of pure, unadulterated pain. Lydia froze her blood, turning to ice. Her first instinct was to flee back to the cabin, but the sound came again, weaker this time, a desperate hitching breath. It wasn't the sound of a threat. It was the sound of a life ebbing away. Her mother's lessons on compassion, faint echoes from a distant childhood, warred with the terror of the day. Guided by the harrowing sound, she moved forward cautiously, her bare feet feeling for roots and stones. She pushed through the curtain of willow branches and stepped into the small clearing. The smell of blood was overwhelming, thick and cloying. The moans were coming from the base of a large cottonwood, just feet from where she usually sat. She took another hesitant step. Her hand outstretched, and her fingers brushed against something. It was warm, slick, and yielded like soft leather. Buckskin. A tremor of fear shot through her, but the pained breathing was so shallow now, it was barely a whisper. This person was dying. "Hello," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. Can you hear me?" There was a faint, wet cough in response, a mumbled word in the now familiar Lakota tongue. Lydia knelt in the damp earth, her dress soaking up the dew, and something else she didn't want to identify. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't see the wounds, couldn't offer any real aid. She was helpless. All she had was her flute. It felt like a foolish, childish gesture. A man was dying and she was going to play him a song. But it was the only comfort she knew how to give. It was her only offering in the face of death. Trembling, she raised the simple wooden instrument to her lips. She thought of the Battle of Finn Blackwood, of the unknown warriors who had fallen. She thought of this man, this enemy of her people, gasping his last breaths alone by a creek. She poured all the sorrow, all the confusion, and all the helpless empathy she felt into her mother's song. The first low, mournful note filled the clearing. The melody that flowed from Lydia's flute was not the same one she usually played. The notes were the same, the structure unchanged, but the soul of it was different. Before it had been a song of melancholy and quiet hope. Now it was a lament. It was the sound of a heart breaking for a world torn apart by hatred and misunderstanding. The notes coiled around the grief that hung in the air, giving it voice, giving it shape. She played for the dying man, a stranger whose people were now at war with hers. In the darkness of her world, she could not see the Lakota warrior's face, streaked with dirt and blood. She could not see the intricate beadwork on his chest plate, now soaked a dark crimson. She could not see the eagle feather, a mark of great honor, matted in his black hair. All she could sense was his fading presence, the slowing rhythm of his life force. His name was Tashunka. In his own language it meant his horse, for he was said to ride like the wind itself. He was the son of the great war chief Hinto, a young man known for his bravery, but also for a wisdom that belied his years. It was he who had counseled against immediate war, urging patience even after provocations. And it was he who had stood on the edge of the creek weeks ago hidden, listening to a blind girl's strange and beautiful music, a moment of peace that had stayed with him. During the skirmish, He had fought with valor, trying to drive the settlers back with minimal bloodshed. But in the chaos, a wild shot from one of Blackwood's panicked men had caught him high in the chest. Mortally wounded, he had stumbled away from the fighting, his strength failing, drawn by some instinct toward the place he had heard the music, the place of the willows by the creek. Now, as he lay dying, the melody returned. Through the fog of pain, Tashunka heard it. The song. The same song from the white girl. It cut through the agony, a cool balm on his spirit. His breathing, which had been a ragged battle for air, began to even out, to soften. He was no longer fighting. He was listening. The melody spoke a language older than words. It spoke of the setting sun, of the spirit's journey across the great river, of a peaceful passage into the Star Nation. It was a song of homecoming, a sacred farewell. A profound sense of peace settled over him. The anger at the white invaders, the pain of his wound, the sorrow of his life cut short. It all began to recede, replaced by the gentle, guiding current of the music. His eyes, which had been clenched shut in agony, fluttered open. He could not see the girl, only the canopy of willow leaves above a dark lace against a darkening sky. But he could hear her. He could hear the breath she took between notes, the slight shift of her body, as she poured her entire being into the flute. She wasn't playing at him. She was playing for him. It was an act of profound, inexplicable grace. With his last ounce of strength, he tried to speak. A single word escaped his lips, a mere whisper of breath and blood. Wiohipeyata, setting sun. Lydia heard the sound, but did not understand it. She felt a subtle shift in the air, a final gentle release. The shallow breathing stopped. The presence, the life force that had been a faint flickering candle in the darkness was extinguished. Silence. The only sound was the gurgle of the creek and the echo of the final note of her flute, which she now lowered with trembling hands. She had played for a dying man until he was gone. Tears streamed down her cheeks, silent and hot. She wept not for an enemy, nor for a friend, but for the sheer waste of it all, for the life that had just ended in the dirt beside her. She stayed there for a long time, a lone, blind girl, keeping vigil over a dead warrior, the instrument of peace resting in her lap. Eventually, the chill of the night roused her. She knew she had to go back. Her father would be worried sick. With a heavy heart, she rose to her feet. She did not touch the body. She simply turned, and with the eerie sixth sense that guided her, made her way back through the darkness to the faint light of her own cabin. She slipped back inside. Josiah was asleep in his chair, the fire now low embers, his rifle across his lap. She moved silently to her small cot and lay down, but sleep would not come. The song she had played echoed in her mind, but it was no longer hers. It belonged to the silence by the creek, to the spirit of the fallen warrior. The next morning, the world awoke to a new and terrifying reality. A Lakota hunting party, sent to search for their missing war leader, found Tashunka's body by the creek. The discovery sent a shockwave of grief and fury through the tribe. He had not died on the main battlefield, but here on land adjacent to the lone settler's cabin. His tracks and his alone led to this spot. To the Lakota, the conclusion was simple and brutal. He had been isolated, ambushed, and murdered, and the blame fell squarely on the inhabitants of the small cabin with the light in the window, the house of Josiah and his blind daughter, Lydia May. News of Tashunka's death traveled like a prairie fire. Grief, sharp and visceral, ripped through the Lakota camp. He was not just any warrior. He was their future. He was the son of Chief Hinto, a man respected for his restraint, a leader who had held the more aggressive factions of his tribe at bay for years. Now Hinto's heart was broken, and his voice of moderation was choked with sorrow. Into this void of grief stepped Wapasha. His name meant red leaf, and he was a warrior as fierce and uncompromising as the autumn fire. Wapasha had long been a rival to Tashunka, not in enmity, but in philosophy. Where Tashunka saw the possibility of coexistence, Wapasha saw only the certainty of annihilation. He believed the white settlers were a pestilence, a creeping disease that would not stop until it had consumed everything. Tashunka's death was the ultimate proof of his convictions. "Look!" Wapasha's voice boomed across the council fire, his muscular frame taut with rage as he pointed east. Hinto's son preached patience, and they answered with murder. He offered a steady hand, and they cut him down in secret like a dog. He was not killed in the heat of a fair fight. He was found by the creek on the land of the lone settler, Josiah. This was an execution. His words found fertile ground in the hearts of the grieving warriors. They saw the logic in his fury. They saw betrayal. Hinto sat his face a granite mask of sorrow. His eyes closed as if to shut out the terrible reality. His son was gone. The fragile dam of his restraint was cracking under a tidal wave of righteous anger. The warriors began to chant Wapasha's name. The sound of war drums, slow and ominous, at first began to beat a heartbeat for the tribe's collective rage. They painted their faces for battle, a sacred and terrible preparation. The target was clear. They would not just strike back at the settlement of Providence. They would first make an example of the homestead where their prince had been found. They would wipe the cabin of Josiah from the face of the earth. Meanwhile, in Providence, a different kind of storm was brewing. Caleb Blackwood had returned not as a hero, but as a failure. He had lost his own son Finn and 3 other men. His arrogant raid had been a disaster, but shame quickly curdled into blame. "It's Josiah," Blackwood raved to anyone who would listen, his eyes wild with grief and fury. "He lives out there practically among them. He speaks their language, trades with them. For all we know, they bypassed us to get to him. Or he led them to our boys. He's a sympathizer, a traitor." The settlers terrified of the inevitable. Lakota retaliation were desperate for a scapegoat. Josiah the outsider, who had always warned them against this path, was the perfect target. The man who had refused to join their militia was now accused of causing its downfall. Fear had twisted logic into a pretzel. They believed the coming Lakota attack was a direct result of Josiah's treachery. They barred the gates of their small, fortified township. When Josiah sent a rider for aid, warning of the coming storm, the message that came back was cold and final. "You are on your own. You made your bed with them, now lie in it." Josiah and Lydia were utterly isolated, caught in a deadly no-man's land, condemned as murderers by the Lakota, and branded as traitors by the settlers. The air around their small cabin grew thick with impending doom. Josiah worked with a feverish intensity, boarding up the single window, reinforcing the door, and cleaning his rifle and pistol until the metal gleamed. He was a practical man, and he would not die without a fight. But Lydia could feel the hopelessness radiating from him. He was one man against an entire tribe. Papa Lydia said, her voice small in the tense silence of the cabin. "The warrior by the creek. I was there. I found him before he died." Josiah stopped his work, turning to her slowly. His face, which she could not see, was a canvas of shock and dawning horror. "What, Lydia? What are you saying?" "He was hurt. He was dying," she explained, her voice trembling as she recounted the story. I played my flute for him." Josiah stared at her, his mind reeling. He sank onto a stool, the hammer falling from his hand and clattering on the floor. His daughter, his blind, innocent daughter, had been the last person with the chief's son. She had played her flute for him as he died. To the Lakota, this would not look like an act of compassion. It would be seen as a ghoulish victory ritual. They had not only found Tashunka's body on his land. His daughter was now a direct witness, a participant in his final moments. They were no longer just suspects. They were damned. "Oh Lord," Josiah whispered, burying his face in his hands. "Oh dear Lord in heaven." He understood now. There would be no reasoning, no explanation. The evidence was absolute circumstantial but emotionally overwhelming. They were going to die. The sun began to set on what they both knew was likely their last day. The vibrant colors Lydia had never seen bled across the sky, heralding the coming night. And with the encroaching darkness came a new sound. It started as a low, deep thrumming, a vibration she felt in the soles of her feet before she heard it with her ears. The war drums. They were no longer distant. They were close, and they were coming for them. The rhythmic, terrifying beat grew louder, punctuated by the high, piercing cries of the warriors. It was the sound of judgment, of unstoppable vengeance. Josiah stood, picked up his rifle, and positioned himself by the door. His face was grim, his body set. He was ready to pay the price for a crime he didn't commit, to protect his daughter for as long as he had breath in his body. Lydia sat on her cot, clutching her flute. The world was shrinking, the sounds of impending violence pressing in on all sides. Fear, cold and absolute, threatened to swallow her whole. But then another feeling surfaced, a strange, defiant resolve. They believed she was a monster, a party to a murder. They believed her father was a traitor. They were wrong. The music she had played for Tashunka had been an act of peace, of shared humanity in the face of death. It was the only truth she had left. As the war cries reached a fever pitch just outside their cabin walls, as she heard the thunder of horses circling their small home, Lydia May stood up. "Papa," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the din. "Unbar the door." "Lydia, no." "Get down," he yelled, his eyes wide with terror. "They think we are murderers hiding in the dark," she said, her grip tightening on the flute. "I will not die a coward. I will face them with the only truth I have." She began to walk towards the door, her small, frail form radiating an impossible strength. "Please, Papa, let them see me. Let them hear the song." Josiah stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. Outside, the world was a cacophony of impending violence, the thunder of hooves, the blood-curdling cries, the ominous rhythmic pound of the war drums. It was the sound of their own funeral. And his daughter, his blind, fragile daughter, wanted to walk into the heart of it. "No," he choked out, moving to block her path. "Lydia, it's suicide. Hiding is suicide," she replied, her face tilted up towards him, her sightless eyes seeming to look right through him. Her voice held no trace of fear, only a profound and unsettling calm. "They are here because of what happened at the creek. I was there. I am the only one who can tell them the truth of it. Not with words, Papa, with my mother's song." Her resolve was a force of nature, as unyielding as the granite of the Black Hills. Josiah looked at her small frame, at the simple wooden flute clutched in her hand, and saw not his helpless child, but the ghost of his wife Annalise, the same quiet strength, the same inexplicable certainty. He knew in his gut that arguing was useless. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps a quick death in the open was better than a terrified one in a dark, besieged cabin. With a hand that trembled violently, he reached for the heavy wooden bar across the door. His heart hammered against his ribs as if trying to escape. He drew the bar back. The screech of the wood was a shriek of surrender. He pulled the door open. The scene that met his eyes was one from his worst nightmares. 100 Lakota warriors, their faces painted in stark, terrifying patterns of black and red, sat upon their horses, forming a semicircle around the cabin. They held spears, bows, and rifles, all pointed directly at the doorway. In the front, astride a magnificent black warhorse, was Wapasha, his face a mask of stone-cold fury. Beside him, older and etched with a fathomless grief, was Chief Hinto. The sudden appearance of the open door and the figure of the settler Josiah sent a ripple through the assembled warriors. A low growl of anticipation rumbled through the ranks. Wapasha raised his hand, his knuckles white, ready to give the signal to attack. Then Lydia stepped out from behind her father. A wave of confusion washed over the war party. They had expected a cornered man, defiant and armed. They had not expected this, a young woman, small and unassuming in a simple cotton dress. A blind woman, her head held high, her unfocused eyes gazing out at them without fear. In her hands, she held not a weapon, but a simple flute. For a moment, the entire prairie held its breath. The war cries died in their throats. The drums faltered. Even the horses seemed to fall silent. All eyes were on the girl. Lydia took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the cool night air, thick with the scent of horse and smoke and rage. She raised the flute to her lips, and she played. The first note hung in the air, pure and clear as a winter star. It was the low, mournful sigh that began the song she had played for the dying Tashunka. The melody flowed out a river of sound in the ocean of silence. It was the lament, the song of the setting sun. The effect was instantaneous and staggering. Wapasha, his hand still raised to signal death, froze as if struck by lightning. His jaw went slack, his eyes wide with utter disbelief. The warriors behind him murmured in confusion and awe, their weapons lowering slightly. They recognized the tune. It was not a settler's jig or a white man's hymn. It was ancient. It was theirs. But for Chief Hinto, the reaction was deeper, more violent. The moment the melody touched his ears, his mask of grief shattered. A raw, guttural cry was torn from his chest, a sound of such profound shock and pain that several of his own men flinched. His body convulsed as if he'd taken a physical blow. Tears, hot and immediate, streamed down his weathered face, cutting paths through the dust and sorrow. It was the Wiyo Hipeyata Olowan, the song of the setting sun. This was not just any song. This was a sacred lament, a spiritual passage known only to a precious few. It was the song a chief sang for his heir, or an heir for his chief, to guide the spirit across the bridge to the ancestors. It was not a song of war or of victory. It was a song of passage of family, of the most intimate and holy farewell. It was passed down from father to son, from mother to daughter, within the direct bloodline of the chief. Hinto had sung it for his own father. He had planned to one day teach it to Tashunka. And now this blind white girl was playing it. Note for perfect heartbreaking note. As the song reached its soaring bird-like crescendo, a story of a spirit taking flight. Chief Hinto slid from his horse. His legs seemed to give way beneath him, and he landed on his knees in the dusty earth. He was not looking at Lydia as a target, but as a terrifying holy mystery. Seeing their chief on his knees, his body shaking with uncontrollable sobs, the warriors were overcome with awe and confusion. One by one, then in dozens, they began to dismount. The fearsome war party assembled for vengeance and slaughter lowered their heads. Wapasha, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, was the last to dismount, but even he could not resist the power of the moment. He too knelt. The entire Lakota tribe knelt in the dirt before the small cabin. They were not kneeling to the settler girl. They were kneeling to the sacred mystery she had unleashed. They were kneeling in the presence of a song that belonged to their soul, played at the very moment their beloved Tashunka's spirit had taken its journey. They were kneeling before the profound, impossible, and terrifying power of the Great Spirit, whose ways were far beyond the understanding of men. The final note of the flute faded, leaving behind a silence more profound and complete than any Lydia had ever known. She lowered the instrument, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the music. In the quiet, Chief Hinto raised his head. His eyes, red-rimmed and full of a terrible, desperate question, were fixed on her. He spoke, his voice raw with emotion, the Lakota words heavy with meaning. Josiah, who understood a little of the language from his years on the frontier, recognized the question. He asks, Josiah whispered, his own voice choked with awe, where you learned the song of his ancestors. The prairie was suspended in a moment of impossible stillness. The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. 100 warriors, instruments of death laid aside, waited for an answer that could either avert a war or consecrate it. Josiah stepped forward, slightly placing a protective hand on Lydia's shoulder. His own fear was gone, replaced by a bewildering sense of destiny, as if he were a pawn in a game he was only just beginning to comprehend. My daughter plays her mother's song. Josiah said, his voice hoarse but clear, speaking slowly, so the Lakota who knew some English could understand. Her mother, Annalise, taught it to her. Chief Hinto rose slowly to his feet, his gaze never leaving Lydia, as if trying to see into her very soul. Wapasha and the others remained kneeling, watching their chief, their faces a mixture of suspicion and reverence. Annalise Hinto repeated, testing the name on his tongue. It meant nothing to him. A white woman. How would a white woman know the Wiyohipeata Olowan? It is a song of my bloodline. It is not for outsiders. The accusation was soft but sharp as obsidian. Josiah's mind raced. He thought back to the few stories Annalise had told him of her life before they met, a life she rarely spoke of. She was an orphan, raised in a mission near the Canadian border. He remembered her mentioning the woman who had been like a mother to her, the woman who had taught her the strange, beautiful song on a flute. My wife, Annalise. She learned it a long time ago, when she was a girl. Josiah explained, searching the chief's face for any sign of understanding. She was taught by a friend, a Lakota woman who lived near the mission. She had married a French fur trapper and was cast out from her people. My wife loved her dearly. The woman gave Annalise the flute and the song. A flicker of something not memory, but the shadow of a memory, crossed Hinto's face. He had heard whispers long ago of a relative, a cousin or a sister, who had broken taboo and run away with a white man to the north. It was a story of shame, buried under decades of silence. What was this woman's name? Hinto pressed, taking a step closer. The intensity in his eyes was terrifying. Josiah squeezed his daughter's shoulder, trying to dredge up the detail from the depths of his memory. It was an unusual name, one Annalise had only said a few times. It sounded like the wind. Winona, Josiah said, finally the name coming to him like a gift. Her name was Winona. The name struck Chief Hinto like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, a hand flying to his chest. Wapasha and the other warriors gasped. The name was known to them. It was a name of legend and sorrow within their tribe. Winona was not just a distant relative. She was Hinto's older sister. She had been his beloved sibling, a free-spirited girl who had fallen in love with a white trapper against the wishes of her father, the chief, before Hinto. When she chose to leave with him, she was declared dead to the tribe. Her name was never to be spoken again. Hinto, then just a young man, had been heartbroken, believing his sister to be lost forever, her spirit wandering without a home. The truth laid bare in that moment was staggering. His sister had survived. She had found a new life, a new family of sorts, and in her isolation she had passed on the most sacred piece of their shared heritage, the chief's lament to a young orphaned white girl named Annalise. Annalise had in turn passed it to her own blind daughter Boer, Lydia. The sacred song had not been stolen. It had been protected, carried in secret through a generation, a hidden stream flowing beneath the earth, only to surface here tonight in the most impossible of circumstances. Hinto looked from Josiah to Lydia, his mind connecting the pieces. His son Tashunka had not been murdered by these people. He had stumbled dying to the place where he had once heard a familiar echo of his own soul. And this girl, this child who carried his sister's legacy in her heart, had found him. Unknowing, she had performed the sacred rite. She had not desecrated his son's passing. She had sanctified it. She had played the Wiohipeata Olowan to guide his son's spirit, a duty that should have fallen to Hinto himself. She was not an enemy. She was in a way that defied all logic family. She was the keeper of his sister's memory, the bridge across decades of sorrow. Tears flowed freely down Hinto's face again, but these were not tears of grief. They were tears of wonder, of release of a sorrow so deep it became a form of grace. He walked forward until he stood directly before Lydia. He reached out not with a weapon, but with a trembling hand, and gently touched the flute she still held. "You," he said, his voice thick with emotion, the word spoken in English, so she would understand. "You have the spirit of a Lakota. You sang my son home." He then turned to his warriors. His voice now filled with the old authority, but tempered by a new profound wisdom, rang out across the prairie. He told them the story of Winona. He told them of the sacred song passed through a ghost of their past to the girl before them. He explained that Tashunka had not been murdered in secret, but had been given the highest honor in his final moments by the one person on this earth outside their tribe who could possibly have known how. A great sigh went through the assembled men, a release of the tension of hatred and the poison of vengeance. Wapasha stared at Lydia, his hard face broken with confusion and shame. He had called for the blood of the one who had honored their fallen prince. Caleb Blackwood and the settlers in Providence, watching from their distant stockade, never knew the full story. They only saw the massive Lakota war party descend on Josiah's cabin, and then stop. They saw them kneel, and then after a long time, they saw them turn and ride away. Not in a chaotic retreat, but in a slow, solemn procession, leaving the small cabin untouched in the moonlight. They would call it a miracle or a trick. They would never understand it was an act of holy recognition. A new, fragile understanding was born that night, not of treaties or laws, but of a shared song on a simple flute. The war was averted. The chasm between the two peoples remained wide and dangerous. But in its center stood a tiny, unshakable bridge. A bridge built by a blind girl who, when faced with a dying enemy, chose not to raise a weapon, but to play a song of peace. Dawn broke not with the menace of the day before, but with a gentle, tentative light. To Lydia, it felt different. The air itself seemed lighter, the morning calls of the meadowlarks less frantic. The oppressive weight of impending doom had lifted, leaving behind a quiet hum of profound disbelief. She and her father had not spoken much since the Lakota had departed. There were no words for what they had witnessed. They moved through the morning chores in a shared, dreamlike silence, the memory of the kneeling warriors as vivid as the scent of pine from the hearth. Around mid-morning, a new sound came from the west. It was not the thunder of a war party, but the steady, unhurried gait of a single horse. Josiah, who was mending a fence post, immediately straightened his hand, instinctively going to the pistol tucked in his belt. He positioned himself between the rider and the cabin door, a silent protector once more. Lydia came to the doorway, her head tilted, listening. She felt her father's tension, a familiar rigidity in the air around him. But the sound of this horse was different. It was not aggressive. It was deliberate, respectful. As the rider came into view, Josiah's breath caught in his throat. It was Wapasha, the fierce warrior who had been the voice of vengeance, the one whose face had been a mask of unyielding hatred, now approached their home alone. He was not painted for war. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the cabin and dismounted. In one hand he held the reins, and over his other shoulder was slung the carcass of a freshly killed deer. He walked forward slowly, his eyes not on Josiah, but on Lydia in the doorway. He stopped 10 paces away and laid the deer on the ground. Then from a pouch at his belt, he withdrew a bound bundle of dried sage and placed it beside the offering. It was a gift of sustenance and a symbol of spiritual cleansing. The son of Hinto heard a true song. Wapasha said, his voice low and raspy, stripped of its former rage. The English was heavily accented, but clear. He was looking at Lydia, acknowledging her directly. Our chief says, your spirit is strong. It built a bridge for his son. This is a gift. So you know our hearts are not at war with this house. Josiah remained silent, his hand still resting on his pistol, unable to process the transformation in the man before him. This was the warrior who had wanted them dead just hours ago. Lydia, however, sensed no threat. She heard the change in his voice. The hard edges had been worn smooth by shame and awe. She took a step forward from the doorway. Thank you, she said softly. The song was for him, for his journey. Wapasha held her gaze for a long moment, his face a complex map of a warrior's humbled pride. He gave a single sharp nod, a gesture of profound respect that conveyed more than 1,000 words of apology. Without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back west, leaving the gifts and the silence behind him. Josiah finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at the deer, a token of peace from a mortal enemy, then at his daughter who stood calmly in the morning sun. In that moment he understood that the world he knew had been irrevocably altered, not by rifles or treaties, but by a melody from a simple wooden flute. They were still alone, and he knew the tales spreading through Providence would only deepen their isolation. But they were no longer on an enemy's border. They lived in a sacred space between two worlds, and his blind daughter was its keeper. That night on the Dakota Plains, a war was not won or lost. It was rendered meaningless. The story of Lydia May and the Kneeling Tribe is more than just a forgotten tale from the Wild West. It's a powerful reminder that the lines we draw between us and them are often built on foundations of ignorance and fear. Lydia couldn't see the warrior's intimidating appearance or the color of his skin. She could only sense his humanity, his pain, and in offering the only comfort she had, a piece of her own soul poured into a simple flute, she unknowingly tapped into a shared history, a hidden connection that was stronger than any hatred. This story challenges us to consider that the person we see as an enemy might just be a distant cousin we haven't met yet. If this piece of hidden history moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button and share it with someone who appreciates stories of courage and connection. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten corners of the past. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.